Hello, everyone, and welcome to Inside National Security by the National Security Academy. I'm Cassian Peña, and today I'm joined with Dexter Ingram.
Hi, I'm Dexter Ingram, founder of Network. Excited to be here today. So I actually started out in the Navy flying planes, and the plane that we flew was called the E-6 Mercury. It was a nuclear deterrent, meaning its job was to speak to submarines that are all around the world. So if the U.S. was ever just obliterated in some nuclear catastrophe, we still have these planes in the air and the submarines in the ocean, so we could always retaliate. So that's a nuclear deterrence, right? Um, that was always fascinating to me, just kind of running out to the airplane, not knowing if things were real or if it was an exercise, not knowing if you're going to see your family again or what's going to happen, where you're going to go afterwards. So that got me thinking a lot. And when I got out of the Navy, I was still really fascinated with WMDs. And I had the opportunity to work at a think tank, really kind of digging into different parts of what I guess piqued my curiosity. Weapons of mass destruction, or WMD, are basically nuclear, biological, chemical, could be radiological, or high explosive. And these are really devastating attacks. That's why you have mass destruction side to that. And we want to do all we can to get ahead of that. We don't want to kind of make the rules up after something like that happens. We really want to kind of look at ways to mitigate that, prevent that, and respond to that if it does happen. So I was fortunate enough, when I got out of the Navy, I was at a think tank. And because I had this curiosity, I went to the Department of Defense and I was actually trained on what's called hazard prediction assessment capability, called HPAC. And that is a computer model that really simulates different nuclear, biological, and chemical attacks anywhere in the world using real-time weather and using census data. So that was pretty interesting. And we would look at different things like terrorist attacks in different cities, hypothetical. We'd also look at hypothetical nuclear exchanges between countries at the time that were kind of at odds with one another, in this case, India and Pakistan. And the media really picked up on that because this was something that was new, it was innovative. It wasn't a perfect computer model, but it did use real-time weather. And the census data that it used allowed us to kind of project what some of the danger would be.
Yes, I remember when we spoke about the role of technology, and you mentioned to me that these models, I mean, they're already so advanced 20 or 30 years ago, and now they must be truly very, very advanced and very capable of analyzing many different scenarios, right? So doing that scenario analysis, I think, is very important. And so, what role do you think within all of this does the US play in terms of WMD related matters and the State Department?
Well, I think it's a whole of government kind of philosophy that we're looking at. I started out in the Navy. The software that I got was Department of Defense software. It was actually from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. And then the State Department actually created a team to stop terrorists from getting nuclear and radiological weapons. Believe it or not, I got a phone call out of the blue asking me to join that team, which was a dream for me. And from there, I got to be a part of the Homeland Security team and what they called at the time the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office. So I got to help build out some of the, I guess, the responses and ways to stop any kind of domestic attack. And then go to the FBI. I spent 3 years in the FBI's Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate, where I got to really help on the law enforcement side too. So it was really just an amazing journey working with some really dedicated professionals, some really great friends, a lot of traveling around the world. I ended up going to Interpol and building out their CBRNE team, which is chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive team. And then kind of also helping a lot with their counterterrorism team on the Defeat ISIS front. But WMD, weapons of mass destruction, have always been at the core of I guess, what speaks to me. Just thinking about the devastation that could occur if somebody who has some kind of nefarious means, wants to enact that upon our country or our allies. Super, super important. I look at different chemical attacks and radiological attacks throughout the years, and you see what polonium does to a body when it's ingested. Once you have that in you, there's nothing that you can do that will save you. You're going to die a really painful death. Having ricin injected in you, again, very, very painful. That happened in Bulgaria with a ricin umbrella tip weapon. And the person died a really just horrible death. We've seen chemical attacks from former Soviet Union agents who were living in the UK who had their doorknobs sprayed with some kind of poison. And luckily, they were found before they passed away. But these kind of attacks still occur. And we see a lot of those kind of coming out of Russia or the former Soviet Union in response to different dissidents that are happening. But then you have the traditional, just country against country kind of threats. You have the North Koreans and the Irans out there that are trying to increase their capabilities as well. If I didn't believe that we could prevent this, I probably wouldn't be as passionate as I am about this. When North Korea first tested its first nuclear, bomb, I got a phone call to the top floor of the State Department where they said, we need you to come up with a plan in the next year to help deter this North Korean nuclear proliferation. I got to work with all aspects of the interagency, with the national labs, looking at air, land, and sea routes coming out of North Korea, looking at transshipment routes, and finding ways to really scan people and vehicles like ships and aircraft, as well as cars, in a pretty thorough and quick way, because you also don't want to shut down the supply of commerce, but you want to make sure that things are safe. We have certain X-ray capabilities that allow us to see inside certain containers. We have certain radiological detection devices that allow us to sense different levels of radiation, especially dangerous levels of radiation or dangerous types of radiation. And then you have dogs, like bomb-sniffing dogs and explosive dogs that are out there that are also checking luggage and bags. So it's a whole, complex system. I think that what we want to do is basically try to push that out as far as we can from our country. We don't necessarily want to deal with things, once they're already in Chicago or coming into the port of New York or LA. We want to look at those things before they even get to our country. So we have to work with partners to come up with certain systems overseas that allow us to screen things before they get shipped or while they're being shipped to the U.S. So we call this defense in depth. So just trying to project that layers of detection out there as much as possible.
And you mentioned something about the commerce side, right? Because let's say with big logistic shipments that you have, it's pretty much impossible to check 100% of all the shipments that go from one place to another. And there were different figures that were thrown around when I looked at this. But most of the shipments that go from one place to another aren't scanned or controlled, etc., because it take way too much time for it to go from point A to point B. And so most of the time, there's only a small extract of those shipments, which gets controlled and scrutinized properly. So in the end, I mean, there's a limited amount of time and resources one can allocate to all of this. Yet, Dexter, would you say that for a young person looking at this field, they might have gotten inspired by you, maybe seeing different people within this field? What would you say to them? How maybe does a day-to-day look like, or what can they maybe learn on this job?
For me, it's always been really exciting working with folks in this field. I mean, you have the international organizations like the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Association, basically in Vienna, that kind of oversees the global aspects and treaties when it comes to nuclear and radiological prohibitions and restrictions. And then you also have different biological and chemical conventions out there as well that the U.S. and other partners sign up for. We're constantly, trying to improve ourselves, but you look at things like COVID, right? What just happened there? Imagine if that was intentional. I mean, that was devastating in and of itself, right? You had millions of people die. You had so many people getting sick. Commerce shut down. It was devastating. The mental and physical toll it took on people around the world in countries and industry hasn't been seen in this century. So imagine if something like that was intentional. We really want to get ahead of these things. So that's why when it comes to public health and national security, we have to work hand in hand. We can't just, think of national security as bombs and guns and ships and tanks. We have to look at all aspects of the nuclear, biological, chemical, radiological, and explosive side of that as well.
Especially with this, like you mentioned, you need the best people working in these positions, right? The most qualified people, because in the end, it's the safety of all of us, right? And so, looking at technology, we briefly talked about this as well, but how important do you think is using and adapting new technologies to countering all these efforts that might go sideways?
I think it's really important. I mean, when you look at large scale events, right, like the Olympics and the World Cup, you actually have whole teams that are, counterterrorism and national security health focused teams that come from Interpol, that come from the US, that come from different parts of the world and region that people never see. They never know are there. But their job is to make sure that the games go off without a hitch, that people are safe, that there's not some large scale attack. Not only are they looking at the intelligence, but they're also looking at the capabilities and everything from the monitoring to the response. It's really amazing. I've seen so much happen over the last 20 years. We've come a long way. There used to be just nuclear material that was out there that we were afraid would get in the hands of folks that wanted to do harm to people. And we were fortunate enough to work with some key partners, including the Russians, in making sure that material could no longer be used to harm people. But it doesn't mean the fight's over. We still have to continue to look for those everyday things. I don't want to throw things out there that would scare people, but there's a lot of things that somebody who wanted to hurt the U.S. could do that might not go detected for some time. And again, I'm not going to give you a list of those things, but I can run those off, and we still have a way to go. But we have some amazing people working on this, and if you're young and you want to get involved in this process, I welcome you with open arms. It's an amazing field, so much to learn. It's taken me to France. It's taken me to the FBI and Homeland Security and the State Department, as well as the Defense Department. So I've really got to do and see it all.
The events that happened in Paris quite recently, not too long ago either, where what did we see? We saw kind of that first there were many outages or especially infrastructure that didn't work. And
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned at that point that this wasn't a coincidence, right? These things can be planned by people who want to make it so the flow of people isn't efficient and hinder that, right?
Probably the US is the biggest target, right? But the US also has the most defenses. So it's the hardest to hit. So while it's the most wanted target, it's the most difficult to achieve. And oftentimes we'll see terrorists and other rogue actors going after softer targets. So they might go after other Western embassies, they might hit key places in Africa. We've seen that over and over again, just because those targets were softer. So I would really, hope that everybody would have the capability and the desire to detect these type of activities. I mean, so much of it is simple too. When I was at Interpol, we would go to places like the Philippines and other countries within the region, and there were a lot of bombs that were killing people from different terrorist factions out there, being made from fertilizer. Now, fertilizer is something that we need to grow food, right? Fruits, vegetables, you name it, all kind of crops. Talking to farmers and business leaders about how much fertilizer they need. And when we see large amounts of fertilizer that is more than what an average farmer or community might need, might go ahead and ring some alarm bells saying, okay, we should look into this a little bit more. Just those simple things like that allowed us to save lives and catch a lot of folks that wanted to do harm to that region. There's also a lot of man-made things out there, like Ebola. When I was at Interpol another time, we would go to Africa and we would talk to some law enforcement officers in Africa who would maybe show up to a crime scene, and maybe it was a car accident, maybe somebody was stabbed or mugged. If there was blood there, they don't know if the person's sick or not. And a lot of times the person would be sick, with Ebola or something like that, and they would take this back to their families, and their whole family would pass away. So we would go to these regions and work with leadership to educate them on certain aspects of keeping them and their families safe, how to wear certain personal protection equipment. We'd even come up with songs for children, so they would understand what to do when they came up with certain situations where there was blood. You know, there's a lot of cultural pieces to that too. A lot of folks would dig up people that passed away because they didn't get a proper burial. Well, once they dig them up, now they're ill and the rest of their family's ill as well. So education really plays a big part into this. There's so many, we can talk about this for weeks. You can tell I'm super passionate about it, but there's a lot we can do and we should do. It's not one of those things where you say this threat is no longer there and we're done. It's an endless cycle of looking at the threats. The threats are getting more complicated. The defense has to be more complicated.
I mean, as you said, even if we go back to the fertilizer, right? Definitely, if like you said, it probably gets flagged in the system, and you definitely have to coordinate with different countries at the same times as well, right? And different states, obviously, and different ministries within the government to make sure that, like you say, if someone purchases too much fertilizer, which can be used to make certain bombs or whatever it might be, that at least you know where that's coming from, and like you say, analyze it better. And also with the children, you know, these having songs or jingles and things like this, it's I think one of the best ways to educate people, like you say.
Back in 2006, we created what's called the Global Coalition to Combat Nuclear Terrorism. And that was co-chaired by the US and Russia at the time, really focused on getting a lot of former Soviet Union radioactive materials disposed of, so you didn't have terrorists using those to make dirty bombs or any other kind of deadly attack. Now, when you come up with certain treaties and those kind of, I guess, international constructions, you do what we say, trust but verify, meaning you might have a treaty, everybody signs onto this treaty, but you need to verify that, meaning you're going to send scientists there to look, physically look and inspect. You're also going to be looking at satellite images and what they're looking like. Are they getting close to building a nuclear weapon, or is it just nuclear, power that they're looking at using and building? I'm glad we have really smart people out there that can go and understand exactly how far away a partner or a country is before it hits certain levels. We also want to make sure that, right now there aren't that many countries that do have nuclear capabilities. We want to make sure that those scientists aren't sharing things with partners or unstable countries for money, for instance. It's a very profitable industry. So all those things kind of matter. We understood that North Korea was kind of closed off to the world for the most part. They were coming up with certain capabilities, working with folks that weren't necessarily friendly with the US. And they had the ability to basically explode a nuclear bomb. And we were able to verify that happened. And once we understood that happened, we wanted to look at the different air, land, and sea routes coming out of North Korea and key partners, and what kind of technical cooperation we needed, what kind of treaties we needed to come up with at partners within the region to kind of contain these various threats. It's really fascinating and very interesting. And once you kind of understand all the different pieces of how the US and our partners come together to interdict some of these threats, to scan for some of these threats, to share information regarding some of these threats, it really is like a beautiful orchestra sometimes. I gotta say, as you're kind of trying to solve these highly complex problems, you gotta know what everybody else is doing. You can't work in a silo. If you're just kind of trying to reinvent the wheel and not understanding the playing field around you, you're probably not going to fill the gaps that's necessary. So what we want to do is fill gaps. We don't want to be duplicative. We want to share information, and we always trust but verify. Things are constantly happening. There's all kind of just health-related illnesses that are out there. I have some amazing friends that are at the top of their game, that are trying to do everything they can to keep safe. These are heroes that you're not going to hear about day to day or see, but they're truly amazing, and they put in the work just in case something like this happens. Hopefully, it never does.
And I think the last question for today, Dexter, is for the general public. Again, I guess for us, for you, the most important thing is safety, right? That everyone is safe and secure, right? Would you say a normal citizen can implement some precautions or some steps in their daily lives to just maybe be on the safer side than if one would be maybe ignorant about all of this?
That's a really interesting question because we're seeing a lot of technology kind of come forward now that really addresses some of these issues. If you look at the new Teslas, right? I don't care what your politics are. Teslas nowadays have a HEPA filter inside, which basically is a biohazard containment filter that allows you to operate and drive and breathe without having to worry about the toxins that are outside. Maybe there's some poison gas. It could be, just a lot of smoke coming from fires in LA, whatever it may be. You have that built into your car, which I think is very fascinating. And
Yes.
then you also have certain pressurized buildings, right? You have buildings out there that have an internal pressure where they keep the air circulating within their building and they're not necessarily pulling in air or letting air seep in from outside that's not filtered. That's another technological advancement we've had. So there's a million different things out there. I mean, people in the 1950s, after World War II, were, building bomb shelters and having gas masks and radiation detection devices. In my man cave, I'm looking at a radiation detection device right in front of me on my wall from the 1950s. These things are still, they still can be used. So I would say don't be paranoid, be informed. I typically make sure that we have certain canned goods just in case of a storm or something like that. But at the same time, I want to make sure that I have lanterns and all the basic things that I would use in kind of a blackout or a flood or just anything in general. So it's not just being prepared for, biological, nuclear, chemical, radiological attack. It's just being prepared, taking care of yourself, doing things that you need to do, and watching for advancements, because I think that's super cool. A lot of the things that we're seeing that are most useful are things that have been around for decades. Those handheld radios that you can crank up, those are wonderful. They don't require batteries, but they're lifesavers.
Yeah, sometimes take a bit those older technologies and make them a bit better or more efficient, but not even change the whole thing, right? Like you say, one doesn't always have to reinvent the wheel. So, Dexter, I must say, I really enjoyed yeah, today's conversation.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation.